Housing insecurity was part of my life as a child. When my father lost his job in one of the recessions that we had in the 50s, we moved from home to home because we could not afford to pay the rent. The good news at the time was that we didn't have the labyrinth of checks and balances that are there today that keep a family from finding other lodging because of background checks and credit checks and all these other things. We did not have that to deal with. However, as a child, it did leave a lasting impression on me. I still remember those days. I remember the knocks on the door. I remember the feeling of moving again. And I remember the feeling of shame that I felt at the time. So I hope that you get a lot from today, and we'll get started. Before Tori and Julia begin, I'd like to start with the familiar ground rules for our group. Since we are a 501c3, we want to make sure that everyone understands that we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and that we do not address politics in our sessions. We address education and the impact that it has, and the impact that mapping has on people. We are guided by a set of values and a mission and a work that focuses on making sure that we help people understand the importance that drawing of maps plays in the policies that are created by our legislators every 2 years in Texas. Today we have Julia and Tori. They are with the organization that is called Texas Low Income Housing Information Services. They're otherwise known as Texas Housers. They focus on developing model solutions for housing and community development problems. They serve as a watchdog over government housing programs, and they strive to provide accurate and easily understood help and information for us in the public. Here today are Julia Orduna. She is the Southwest Texas Regional Director. Her focus is on housing affordability and the lack of access to safe and dignified
Join the meeting,
as well as climate change in Houston and the surrounding areas and the impact that it has on housing. She has a BS in Biomedical Sciences from Texas A&M University, Master's in Public Administration from Texas A&M University, the International Division. Tori Tavormina is the Eviction Prevention Specialist, and her focus is on improving eviction policies through research, analysis, and advocacy. And in her previous life, she was in healthcare, and she uses that information to help prevent evictions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julia and Tori. Welcome.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you all for having us. We're very excited to talk about what we've been focusing on as far as tenant stability, housing, eviction issue, and where Texas Housers sees a lot of these advocacy points and how people can get involved. So we're just gonna dive right in. So in order to talk about tenant stability, really we need to talk about housing and housing stability and access to affordable housing. So a lot of the information that we're going to see right now comes from the National Low Income Housing Coalition's GAP report. And so their 2021 report is based on 2019 data. And their information, here we see the nation map of low-income housing accessibility. And so it says very obviously, no state has adequate supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters. What the map shows right here is the rate at which housing is available and affordable for extremely low income renters. And when we're talking about extremely low income, these are people that make 30% of the average median income, the area median income, AMI, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So don't worry too much, but understand that these are the extremely low income cases. And so in Texas, we see that there are almost 1 million, so 838,000 people, households have low income issues. And so they are the most in dire need of affordable and available housing. Yet in Texas, there are only 29, no, Tori, stay on the other one, please. There are only 29 units available for every 100 households that are available and affordable to these homes, or to these families. So 29 out of 100, we see that there is a very big desperate impact and just this gap of availability. And so that's a very big picture. Let's actually go into the Texas information. Go ahead. And so when we're talking about these income levels, what is affordable and available, it very much has to do with the income level of the area. And so we see this first definition is that area median income. So it's the average income level that a family has in that metropolitan or non-metropolitan area. So to give you an example, in Houston, 100% area median income for a family of 4, that household income would be $76,300 for a family of 4. And that is 100% average. So when we're talking about extremely low income, these are people that make 30% of that average 100%. If we're talking about the very low income, they're anyone that makes between 31 and 50% of that AMI number. And when we're talking about low income, they're normally about 81 to 100%. And so we're looking at those numbers, that 30%, 50%, 80%, and 100% are the numbers or the gaps at which we start really dividing people into those brackets and buckets. And so when we're targeting the very extremely low income, it's important to understand that targeting is important, that while we may have units at 80%, it doesn't mean that that's affordable or accessible for people that have that 30% AMI. And so in Texas, we know that fair market rent, and so what is average and fair in the market for a 1-bedroom is $946. For a 2-bedroom, it's $1,143. And so in order to pay for that 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment at an affordable rate, you'd either have to work 2.5 full-time jobs for that 1-bedroom, or 3 full-time jobs, or work 121 hours a week to be able to afford that 2-bedroom apartment. And so in Texas, to be able to afford a unit, you'd have to make at least $22 to be able to work 1 full-time job at affordability rate. And so this information, this table, shows us the most severe cases and the least severe cases of affordability at the metropolitan level throughout the nation. Unfortunately, we do see Houston is the number 2 as the most severe in lacking affordable and accessible available units for the extremely low income. We also see Dallas on this list. So 2 of our metropolitan areas in the nation are the most severe of lacking affordable and accessible units. While they are within 19 and 21 affordable and accessible units, we see that within the rest of the nation, the best case scenario is having 50 units for every 100 households at the extremely low income level. So while Texas is not doing great, we're not saying that the rest of the nation is doing that well either, but it is something that we need to improve exponentially. So let's backtrack a little bit and talk about area median income again, this AMI. And so we hear about that a lot when it comes to affordability and funding and accessibility and housing accessibility. And so there, we're looking at these brackets. Each column is also either household size or that percentage of income bracket that you're living in. So let's look at that 4-person. A lot of the numbers are based on 4-person household levels. And so while 100% is not on here, and we are going to have that on a slide later. So the 100% is that $76,300 as a household income. We see that that 30% is at $25,750. That is a major gap, and well, that is a 70% reduction, which makes them come into that 30% area median income for a family of 4. So those are the people that we're saying there are only 19 units available to them for every 100 households, and they are making less than $26,000 as a whole. And so when we start looking up that chain, Tori, can you go back, please? When we start looking up that chain, we see that the highest income bracket over 100% at that 120 median income level is almost hitting that 6-figure numbers as an income. So it is very important to target where we are getting this affordability levels for affordable housing. Go ahead, Tori. So now diving deeper into what is the Houston, Woodlands, Sugar Land metro area. So when we're looking at income census data, they tend to look at this metropolitan area as a whole. And so to highlight again, there are only 19 available and affordable units for every 100 extremely low income households in this area. And we've got, again, these area median incomes. And so those 19 units, we see that almost 80% of these households are severe house cost burden. And what that means, when someone is severely house cost burden, it means that that household spends more than 50% of their income on rent or utility bills. And so if they are having to leave their affordable and available brackets, they are moving out of that accessibility to find housing that is no longer affordable to them. And now they're looking at targeted units that may be for those 50% income brackets. And so now they are taking those 46 units that are available and accessible to people at that 50% income bracket. One, there is not enough for those 100 households. And 2, because there is not enough housing for the extremely low income, they are now having to move into a higher income bracket and take some of those 46 units for the low income people, for those people at 50%. So now we are saying that the 30% AMI, that there are 81 households lacking a unit, are now looking for those 46 units that are for the income bracket, the next income bracket. And if those people don't have available and accessible housing, they're going to have to look at the housing that is available for 80%. And then they're going to have to look higher and higher. So when there is no availability in their income bracket, they're now becoming severely cost burdened. We do see on this graph that there are 100 units at 80% AMI for 100 households at 80% AMI. So that means there are barely enough available and accessible units for people with 80% AMI in the Houston area. And if their units are being taken up by people at 50% or 30% AMI, then they too are going to be looking above their income bracket. And so they're not as many, but there is a 3% of this 80% AMI that is spending more than 50% of their money on their rental, their rental bills. And so this is just to show that targeting of affordable units is very important. And I will talk a little bit more when it comes to policy, but when we do see the city and creating affordable units, they tend to target at 80% AMI. And so we as advocates say, we don't need more units at 80% or 100% AMI or further, because this is now fair market rent. We need very intentional targeted at these lower income and extremely low income brackets to be able to deal with the housing instability that we see across our Houston area. And I will also say, this isn't a number we have on here, but Houston is a renter area. We are about a little more renters than homeowners in this area. I think it's and I don't want to throw out a number, but it's a little above 50% are renters, and maybe a little at that 40% are homeowners. So we also have to understand the people that we're serving is more than half the population when we're talking about affordable rental units or rental units in general. And so thinking about affordable units and accessibility ties into a lot of what we're talking about today of the state of evictions. And so I will say, I thought it was a little double entendre here, talking about the state of evictions is where we are now in evictions and the state of evictions being Texas. Here we do have some information about from Eviction Lab. And so this first graph we're seeing about the eviction filings last week. So based on Eviction Lab numbers, they are looking at 30 metropolitan areas, 4 of them being in the state of Texas. And according to last week's numbers, all 4 of our metropolitan areas are in the top 10 most filings out of these 30. And so we're seeing Houston still at the very, very top of this. We had 1,500 filings in 1 week. And Dallas and Fort Worth also kind of meeting that, getting over that 1,000 or close to that 1,000. Outside of that number, we also have the eviction filings throughout the pandemic. And so from these 30 metro areas that Eviction Lab is tracking, 3 of our 4 are also in the top 10 numbers. And so we see Houston being number 3, as from starting of March 15th of 2020, we have had almost 75,000 evictions filed in the last, throughout this pandemic. And so we're seeing these numbers continue to creep. And so it is important to call out, while we know Texas is a very big state, it is also understanding that we have this instability that we need to protect our renters and protect not only tenants, but landlords, because they are the ones that are maintaining the tenant stability as well. So it's very important to understand what is happening in the state and in these numbers and how eviction filings are affecting tenants.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, as Julio was saying, it's very important to think about keeping people housed. So the work that I'm going to talk about today that we're doing right now is focused on keeping Texans housed. Technical difficulties. There we go. So this work, our eviction work, is kind of separated into 3 main segments. So first, we are tracking the emergency rental assistance programs in the state and locally. We're also following eviction filings across the state and working on understanding eviction court and what's going on in eviction court. And I'll talk about each of these a little bit more. So emergency rental assistance, we actually created a dashboard with the data we're collecting. And this data is received through public data requests from the local programs and the Texas state program. And just to back up for a second, emergency rental assistance is a COVID era protection meant to try and keep people in their homes. And so what we're doing looking at this data is trying to see which programs are efficiently distributing their funds and the equity of that distribution as well. We also, looking at March 31st coming up, there might be funds recaptured. So Texas Housers believes that the local Texas programs will be losing a total of $103 million back to Treasury. There's no telling whether Treasury will redistribute that funding to us or other states. So we are trying to advocate for those funds to be allocated back to the state program so that money could at least stay in Texas. But yeah, that's coming up soon. And here is this dashboard zoomed into Harris County specifically. That's where the work I'm doing is. I'm in Harris County, by the way. I didn't include that, sorry. But right, Harris County, we actually got more funding. So this program is still going on, and it actually is doing well compared to some other programs. And you can see on the dashboard, it says 90% of the funds in this program have been distributed to extremely low income households. So that's definitely a measure of success here. And then, so we also have an eviction filing dashboard, which similarly comes from public data requests. And so here we're tracking statewide evictions to document and kind of monitor the severity of this issue. I zoom in, yep. And then zoomed in on Harris County, you can see there were almost 4,000 cases filed in December. And then that bright yellow line there shows that the number of eviction filings we had, well, the line is the number of eviction filings we had in March 2020. And so in July, last July, we reached that number already and we surpassed it. And the significant part of July is that's when the federal courts let the CDC eviction moratorium expire. So after that, we've been above those filing numbers. And those numbers are pretty high. So this is just showing that we have been making headlines. Harris County has been making headlines for this eviction crisis, these high filings. And then so going into why we're watching eviction court. So as we track those qualitative numbers, quantitative numbers, as we track those, we also want to see what's going on in our community, right? How these protections might be playing out in our communities. And we know that each eviction filing and each ERA dollar is connected to a person or a household and their story at the end of the day. So early on in the pandemic, we recognized the importance of seeing how these protections were being executed on the ground and in real time as well. So we're able to say this is what we're seeing today. And this work does have multiple points of impact. So we do use it to try and keep individual court judges and administrators accountable, to work with state and local ERA administrators to understand barriers of programs, And then number 3, communicate tenant needs and system issues to legislators, to inform the public of current housing issues in the community, and to provide resources for tenants in the eviction process. Okay, and then in eviction court, we do see a lot of irregularities. So one big one is engagement in eviction diversion and prevention programs. So that would be the ERA, Emergency Rental Assistance Program, falls in that category. And basically, so that means some judges make sure to make like community navigators present and try and talk to tenants and landlords about the emergency rental assistance process and applications, things like that. And then second, court accessibility is very irregular. So that can be language and disability accommodations, such as live Spanish interpretation, Spanish language interpretation, and then as well as virtual accommodations, which we saw more of early in the pandemic. Our judges were using Zoom and allowing litigants to participate in court and attend their hearings virtually, but those have slowly been falling away with time. And then we also have transparency in data reporting irregularities. So in our eviction filing dashboard, we have been able to see that not all courts report on their data, which they are required by law to do. So we should be able to access that data. And then last, judge practices. So this can be things like the questions they ask, the resources they provide. And although eviction and displacement is not something they can just stop from occurring, they can hold fair and just rulings that kind of equalize the power balance between tenants and landlords. So that's something we're working on. Other trends we've seen. So there's a lack of legal assistance. Most tenants do not have legal representation, and landlords typically do. Also attendance and default rates. So when a lot of tenants don't know they need to show up to the hearing date. So when they don't, it's often a default for the landlord for eviction. So tenants knowing that they need to attend their hearing is very important. And I also note here that virtual attendance options were very helpful in making that more accessible for tenants. And then we have also seen a number of barriers to the rental relief programs. One of them being Landlord Buy-In. So some of the programs are designed to include the landlord and the tenant in the application process and to get funds and everything like that. But that means that if the landlord doesn't want to participate, that cuts off the tenant's access to this resource meant for housing stability. So that's definitely a barrier. And then there's also a flaw in program design where eviction filings are required for some programs. So before a tenant can't apply until they have an active eviction case filed against them. And in that case, it's basically incentivizing the landlord to file an eviction, which ideally we'd want to get funds to a tenant before the eviction filing even happens. And then last here, lengthy processing time. So with the large number of applications for rent relief, it could take a considerable amount of time for the tenant and landlord to actually receive funds. And a lot can happen in that amount of time, right? A tenant could be evicted before their application was fully processed, unfortunately. Okay, and then court irregularities is up there again. But we are kind of translating each of these things to things we're doing. So for lack of legal assistance, we are trying to advocate for more legal aid funding and policy. We're also advocating for virtual access and tenant outreach prior to the hearing. For the barriers to rental relief access, we've been working with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs and other community partners who administer the rent relief programs in order to address these different barriers and mitigate them as we can. And then for court irregularities, we're trying to hold the justices of the peace more accountable. We actually published a list of best practices for justices of the peace, and we're doing a bit more. And that's kind of one of the reasons we're here today, actually. So justices of the peace, who are they? They are local elected officials in control of eviction proceedings and judgments. One justice can hear hundreds of eviction cases a day, which we do see happening in Harris County. And this is the map of Harris County, by the way. And so these justices of the peace actually hold a lot of power in our communities. And we definitely need more public awareness and accountability for these elected officials on the local level. So some facts about them: they are elected every 4 years. They hear other cases like traffic cases, civil suits, and small debt claims as well. And their minimum qualifications are to be a resident of Texas for 12 months, to preside in the precinct that they're running in for 6 months, and to finish 80 hours of continuing education and 20 hours annually thereafter to be a justice of the peace. And so I note that no judicial or legal background is required for these judges. And then there are also more than 800 justices of the peace in Texas. Each Texas county has 1 to 8 justice of the peace precincts, and each precinct can have 1 to 2 JPs. So Harris County has 16, and those are all those little red dots there. And precincts that have more than 18,000 people are the ones that can have more than 1 JP. And so looking at this map specifically, I do want to note that the Harris County lines were last redrawn in 2013 after the 2010 census. And so now that the 2020 census is done, we can be redistricting. And then the Justice of the Peace precincts are actually drawn with our constable precincts. So that's where they come from. All right. And if we have any questions, now's the time.
Thank you. That's a lot of information. Are there any questions?
I have a question. Since we will be electing several Justice of the Peace judges this year, what would be 1 or 2 most pertinent questions related to this subject to ask them?
That's a good question. So since we are also a 501c3, so we can't give specific questions per se, but thinking about kind of their role as hearing eviction proceedings, you could definitely ask about kind of what they plan to do regarding eviction, you know, even if they acknowledge that there is an eviction crisis going on in Texas, things like that, like what what will they be doing during their time.
What kind of plans they would have to alleviate, these hearings taking so long, that kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah, and like Tori mentioned, we just published on our blog, and we can drop the link here too, a best practices of what we see is what we think a judge should be doing and how they can utilize their court and their space and the other programs and policies around them to best serve tenants and landlords and actually alleviate some of the burden on their own court if they utilize the mediation and the navigators. Then there's probably less cases that will even make it to the bench, and less cases on the bench means they have more time to actually give a just case. So I think that definitely asking what they're doing to provide justice for tenants and landlords, and what they're doing for accessibility as well during this pandemic, I think is a big part. And if you'd like to share with them the best practices, or if they have anything to add, it's definitely a working list. We've been working with partners to see what else we suggest should be done. And if there's something that they'd like to add or talk about, we are more than happy to talk to them as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I did look over that list. It's very thorough. So, but other than our vote, what other ways are there of holding these judges accountable?
Yeah, so I know we were going to get into some of this advocacy point a little further into the presentation. Lydia, do you want us to do some of that now, or?
I have some questions I'd like to ask. What does advocacy in this arena also include advocacy for a living wage?
I think that's I think it's part of it. I'll say that in order to attain housing, you need to be able to pay for it, and having a living wage has a lot to do with what is accessible and available to you. I think I will say that we don't necessarily touch on labor within Texas Housers. We do know several partners that do a lot of labor work and work within the labor unions. And so they're very much, and actually I will mention that the Gulf Coast Area Labor Federation has been organizing around housing accessibility because their own members and participants have seen so much issue in their housing insecurity because of the fact that this economic crisis is happening during the pandemic. That loss of wage was something that was so big that the majority of people that are going through eviction court right now have never been through eviction court, have never had any type of housing instability, have never had that lack of wage. And so yes, a lot of that has to do with it. And so because so many people were affected by it during the pandemic, evictions came under a microscope. Evictions has been a big issue even before the pandemic, and unfortunately it's always been those with that wage insecurity or housing inaccessibility. And so now that it's more than just the low income people that are affected by it, it's becoming a problem for the larger population, and now we are paying attention to it. And so I will say, while the pandemic created this as, call it an opportunity, it is something that has been happening long before. And so now we are actually seeing it as a problem and taking the steps necessary to make sure that housing stability is an issue, or is not an issue post-pandemic as well.
The other question that I had was in regard to the $403 million that we may be losing. Why?
Yeah, so it's $103 million.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the money that was given to local jurisdictions by the Treasury had a lot of regulations stuck to it. And so there have actually been 2 recaptures already. And so there was a minimal portion taken back. And so I believe in December, the programs had to have spent either 15% or 25%. And I'm sorry, I don't have that percentage, but there was a certain portion that had to be spent of that ERA funding 1 and 2. So I guess let me backtrack a little. We did get ERA 1 was a pot of funding came, and then ERA 2. So there have been multiple funding sources that have come down, and then which each of those funding sources, there was a percentage had to be spent or obligated or awarded by a certain point in time. And so that certain point in time is March 31st. And so if jurisdictions do not spend 50% of their funding by March 31st, they are going to lose that funding. And so we did publish another blog, and that information is on our website as well, with all of the jurisdictions that are going to be losing funding after that, or on that March 31st. And based on the calculations that we assume that Treasury is going to take from that funding is what they did in the last recapture, we are assuming that it is a total of $103 million throughout all of the local jurisdictions that are going to be losing money. Harris County actually received money in this last reallocation. So Harris County, Houston Harris Help got $13 million to put back into rental assistance. It was a little more than that, but some of that is administrative funding. So they have 13 million to give back in rental assistance. And so they may still get a little more because this recapture is going to happen. All this funding goes back to the Treasury, and then Treasury, from getting all that funding, will then redistribute however they see fit. And so that's where we are hoping that local jurisdictions, they do have the opportunity to voluntarily give the money to the state, to TDHCA, who's operating this rental assistance at the state level, instead of it being involuntarily recaptured, returned to the federal government, and then the federal government deciding, does that money come back to Texas or does it go somewhere else? We won't know if we'll get those full 103 million, or we'll get less. Maybe we'll get more because of other jurisdictions in other states, just because the need is so big in Texas. That's just something we don't know yet, but we are at risk of losing these funds for sure.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? Okay, so how does all of this tie into community districting? Tori already spoke to the role of the justices of the peace in terms of the county commissioners. And what I'd like to do right now is just highlight the legislative level of things, you know, your House representative and your Texas senator. This past legislative session, I found 2 bills that applied to home ownership. There may have been more, but these were the 2 that stood out in someone's review. 43, Senate Bill 43 relates to residential mortgage loans, and it's something called a wrap mortgage. And House Bill 3788 is important for homeowners because it deals with the appraisal review board members that are critical in setting our taxes. So when you're looking at community districting, who your legislator is determines the type of policy that may be passed through the legislative session. And so that's how maps come into play from the perspective of home ownership. When it comes to landlord and tenant law, I found 3 bills that were highlighted. One, I didn't realize this. I knew that homeowners, that when you went to buy a house, it was important, people were required to disclose whether or not they were in a flood zone area or had been flooded before. But for the first time now, tenants have to be informed. The other thing too is that in Senate Bill 1783, landlords now, may ask for a monthly fee instead of a security deposit. As I found out with one of my own kids, when they were looking for an apartment, they needed something like the first month and the second month plus a security deposit in order to even get into an apartment. And so that may alleviate things. I don't know the ins and outs of the bill, but that one is there. And then in House Bill 900, it releases owners, landlords, from damages that may result in the execution of an eviction suit. So those three bills were passed by the legislature, the last legislature. Under the new maps, your new or former or current representative or senator will once again be making decisions in the next legislative session that deal with homeownership and tenants. So that's why maps are important. Justices of the peace, Tori covered. I was surprised to learn that in counties where there's no medical examiner, they act as the coroner. And I wonder what kind of qualification they have to do that. But that's one of the things that they do. And we were trying to picture this whole idea of having more than one justice of the peace per commissioner, particularly in Harris County, because every county has 4 commissioners, right? And we keep hearing about commissioner for precinct 5 and commissioner for precinct 8. And I'm thinking, what in the world is all of this? Well, this is how it breaks out. You have the county commissioner here, and underneath you have 2 precincts for that one county commissioner. And underneath each precinct, you have 2 justices of the peace. And that's how you end up with the 16. So in relationship to maps, what is the critical point? The critical point is this county commissioner, and how that map is drawn then determines their viewpoint in terms of how to go about the process of dividing their commissioner precinct. Tori also spoke about the qualifications of a justice of the peace. And, you know, this 6 consecutive months of living in a precinct does not, in my opinion, give you enough time to know your community and what you're getting into. So I wonder how that impacts decisions. Also, these are not being convicted of a felony, which I hope it applies to all elected officials. Also, that they're not mentally incapacitated. I wondered why that was included in the qualifications. And these 80 hours of continuing education don't have to take place until their first year. So in office during their first year. So they don't have to know anything before being elected, basically, is what it amounts to. So that again is something that could be impacted by legislation to shore up the qualifications for a justice of the peace. So questions to ask. What is it that we need to be asking as advocates for fair community districting is when we started to search to see, okay, in counties that have more than one justice of the peace per commissioner, how is the workload divided? Is it caseload? Is it territory? How is that done? How is that determined? How often is it done? By whom? And it all goes back to that commissioner and commissioner's court. So in asking questions is the only way we're going to get answers. And just for fun, here are the justices of the peace in Harris County with how long they have been in office. This particular person has been there since 1989. Let me see, which one is another one that I found had been there quite a while. This one is from 2011. Here's one from 1997. Some of these people, when I look them up, are retiring, but not all of them. So it's important that we continue to get educated about these positions, because, you know, they come up in our ballot every year, and we have this long list of judges that do all different types of things. And you wonder, what should the qualifications be for these people in these offices? And how are they executing these offices, and what impact is it having on our community? So from our perspective for community districting, the call to action is find out how, right, in your own county. For example, I found out that in Fort Bend County, under the previous precinct 1, there are 2 justices of the peace. It's the only precinct in Fort Bend County that has 2 justices of the peace, precinct 1. Now, precinct 1 was dramatically changed. So I wonder what's going to happen now. And I wonder when they're going to do it. And I wonder who's going to make the final decision. And I did reach out to the Fort Bend County Judge's Office, and I haven't gotten an answer. So I'm going to keep on reaching out to find out how it's done. And I encourage everybody else to do the same with their county. Now, in terms of housing insecurity, Tori and Julia are now going to give us some ideas of how we can advocate for that.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, these are some policies that could help. So we advocate for lots of different things. The first one being local tenant protections, and those can come in multiple different forms. They could be city ordinances or emergency orders. So the difference would be a city ordinance is a little more in the books, and emergency orders normally have a time to expire. But we look at right to counsel as an ordinance or an emergency order that we could have locally enacted. And that, like in criminal courts, this is mandatory currently already. Unfortunately, in civil courts, we do not have a right to legal counsel. And so tenants are left at their own will, either to find a legal representative or hire an attorney, which if they're already behind on rent, they probably don't have funds to hire an attorney. So we're asking for the right to legal counsel be an ordinance as a mandatory thing that tenants can access and should have whenever they go to court. Mandatory mediation is another thing that could be put into an ordinance. Currently in the state of Texas, if you are behind on rent, based on your lease, once you're past your late grace period, if you will, on your rent, your landlord can give you a notice to vacate. That notice to vacate can be served 3 days before they file for eviction. So you only have 3 days before your landlord turns around and starts the eviction process once they send you a notice to vacate. Having mandatory mediation would mean that they would have to go through someone else to talk about the issue, mediate the issue, and if no agreement comes out of that mediation, then they would file for an eviction and then proceed with the process. If we could meet people at mediation before they go to the process, probably we could meet or find a lot of ways to help tenants before the landlord actually decides to evict them, because a lot of landlords don't want to evict their tenants. This just becomes no other solution but to go through the legal recourse of evicting the tenant and getting something, or at least getting the possession of their property back. Another thing that we're advocating for is this grace period. And so, like I said, regular times in Texas, once you are behind on your rent, you can get that notice to vacate. And so what a grace period does is that it allows a time period in which the tenant is allowed to catch up on rent and become current on rent. Currently in Texas, or some of the emergency orders that we saw in Texas for a grace period, is Travis County had a 60-day right to cure, meaning that you have 60-day grace period to cure your back rent. And after those 60 days, if you're still behind on rent, then your landlord can file for an eviction. In Hays County, which is where San Marcos is, they actually had a 90-day grace period. So a person had 3 months to cure their back rent before they could get filed against an eviction. Unfortunately, in Texas, and the way that the law is written, you can fall behind on rent and be evicted in the same month. So there's very minimal protection. And if you just didn't have a way around it and your landlord is not willing to work with you, that same month you can get kicked out of your house. The other thing that we do ask for or advocate for is type of tenant stabilities, and some of this is record expunging. So having a filing, not even an actual judgment against you, but having a filing against you is detrimental to your success in multiple things. So we know these filing evictions stay on your record for at least 7 years. And so that is any type of background check that can be done. This can affect you in any further housing searches, that if a landlord says no eviction records, that is now becoming an issue for you to find another housing or another rental space to move into. It is also an issue in finding employment. Unfortunately, lots of employers will see that as an issue and will not hire someone that has an eviction on their record. And while evictions and employment have nothing to do with each other, this is still something that affects people in the long run. And we don't know that, or people don't see that until after it becomes an issue for them. And so finding a way to expunge these records, or having second chance housing, making sure that there are landlords that are willing to work with people that have evictions on their records. So they are not then either looking from place to place, being housing unstable for so long that they either become homeless or doubled up, or that they are having now to look for something that is extremely out of their income bracket and now are becoming severely cost burden in their rental bills because the only person that was willing to rent to them was something that is exponentially expensive or completely out of reach for them, which then may possibly come back to become a housing stability issue. They no longer can pay for rent because it is completely inaccessible and too expensive for them. And now then they fall behind on rent again. And maybe they are going to face another eviction because they decided to find only housing available to them that was just way too expensive for them. So finding those things that can actually stop this feedback loop of evictions and maybe perpetuating evictions in people's lives. And so within those rental protections that we can have the elected officials actually partake, there are so stability programs that they can find a way to do. So city and county can fund these programs, and that's what we can ask them to do, is put up money to fund either navigation programs that we're currently seeing. The Alliance is one of them, that they sit in court to help navigate through these rental assistance programs, or before they come to court, they work with tenants and landlords to get through the programs and navigate these resources. Some of that is also kind of coupled up with mediation that we were talking about, that mandatory mediation. The eviction diversion programs, that's essentially what navigators do. They are part of these eviction diversions. They try to, like it says, divert the eviction. And so they work through mediation, they work through these programs, through rental assistance programs that are also part of that emergency diversion to navigate. So all of these programs actually work in tandem with each other to be able to fund or to be able to maintain that housing stability that we're trying to seek for these tenants. And so what we've seen currently in the pandemic, we had all these protections start stacking up and really, really beef up what is tenant stability. And slowly they started falling away. First was the CDC moratorium that ended in July. And like Tori showed us, right after that ended, we start seeing eviction filings start creeping back up. The rental assistance programs, they're not in perpetuity. And so they are only for the pandemic. And once that funding runs out, there's no more money. So how do we continue to maintain this stability? That program has stopped. And so there's nothing left for them. And so we're slowly losing all these programs, these grace periods, these protections for renters that was actually making a difference in their stability. So we as advocates are asking, how do we keep these protections that are proven methods now for stability and keep them ever long, ever present in not just pandemic and emergency times, but in the court of law and as a resource for tenants and landlords moving forward and moving out of this pandemic. And so one of the things that we can do to make sure that these protections don't just stay in emergency times is find a way to activate this in the legislature. And so like Lydia was saying, some of those things that have already happened, I will point to one that you mentioned right now. As soon as Hurricane Harvey happened, that's when we got that homeowners must be told when purchasing a home that it was flooded after Hurricane Harvey happened. And so we thought about the homeowners, but we didn't think about the renters until 2022, that this year that legislation passed. And so there's this gap of time between what is being given to homeowners and what is being given to renters. And unfortunately, renters are the most vulnerable, are the most housing unstable. I personally am a renter, and the moment my landlord decides that they don't want to rent to me anymore, I am no longer stable. I fear my stability because of that fact, because of the fact that I am a renter. And so now we need to find those protections for renters through the legislation. One of them that we tried to work on the last legislative session, and we are still workshopping with tenants in San Antonio and hoping to push into the next legislative session, is a tenant bill of rights. These are certain things like source of income discrimination. So when a tenant has a voucher, has a subsidy, lots of renters or lots of landlords, I'm sorry, are actually blacklisting people with Section 8 vouchers. That is now becoming a new segregation tactic of saying no Section 8 here. That is a source of income discrimination. And we cannot allow landlords to do that to renters, because then they are not giving them the chance to choose where they house, even though they have the funds. It may not be their own income. It is something that has been given to them by the government, but it is and should be allowed to be given or be accepted as rental funding. And so this source of income discrimination is a big part of something we're folding into this tenant bill of rights, among many other things. Like Tori also talked about, is language accessibility or other accessibility to a just trial. We do know there are certain things that justice of the peace have to do currently in discovering what is happening in this case, and that's not happening. That is, due process is not happening, and it's already written into law. So how do we maintain that accountability, and how do we add more protections like language accessibility? If a non-English speaker comes into the court, we have seen multiple times that either a court clerk who is not an experienced interpreter, and I'm sorry, interpretation is a very, very dedicated skill. It takes time and understanding to be a good interpreter, because it's something that I am trying to do, and I don't pretend to be a proven and paid a licensed interpreter. I am a bilingual person. I am not an interpreter, and there are very big differences between those two that we don't see that as an issue in the court. We've also seen the JPs themselves say, well, I am bilingual, I'll interpret for you. And so they actually have a whole case dialogue with the landlord, and the tenant cannot dispute the facts of the landlord's testimony. And then the JP will pass a judgment, and the only thing that is actively interpreted to the tenant is there is a judgment against you and now you have to move. That is not a just trial. That is not accessibility. And so we need to make sure that these things are written into law, and they are written into law in a way that they are held accountable as well. Just like Tori was saying about this reporting, JPs are supposed to report to the Office of Court Administration all their filing numbers and their judgment numbers. And you can see on our data, on our dashboard, we do have something that says missing data. There are many, many justice of the peace that do not report on a monthly basis. And sometimes they skip 1 or 2 months. There are some that never report. And this is written into law. But there is no way to actually hold them accountable. There is nothing written into the law to hold them accountable. So how do we make those changes in the law, in the legislation as well, or some of the things that we at Texas Housers are advocating for?
All right, and then so that is kind of long goal, I guess. We also included some things that you could start doing today. Oh wait, oh no, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Some things that you can get to maybe sooner, or let's see.
Sorry, that transition threw me off. So things that you can do, advocate for local better protections, for better local protections and accountability. Hold your elected officials accountable. Like we mentioned, the justice of the peace is an elected official, and so they are accountable to constituents. We are actively in elections, and so while we mentioned that they are elected every 4 years, they hold an office for 4 years, the place 1 and place 2 stagger every 2 years. So 2 years ago, during the presidential election, place 1 JPs were elected. Currently, in this year's election, place 2 JPs are elected. And so we are seeing some of that changing of the guard this year. There are certain JPs, and funny, Lydia, that you mentioned some that have been on the bench since the 80s. They're actually not running for re-election. Both of those JPs are actually running for different positions in totally other races. But yes, like making sure that they are being held accountable. And like we also heard, they have no judicial background. So are they walking into this position with some understanding as to what they are supposed to be doing and how to hold the law, to hold tenants and landlords accountable to the law? We need to hold them accountable to it as well. Pushing for more targeted affordability in housing to make sure that we are reducing concentrations of poverty and actually letting people in low income brackets move into higher opportunity areas so their children can access better schools and can have those opportunities to move up in their own understanding of what is accessible and attainable to themselves. And so, like I was saying before, targeting that accessibility, making sure that the city is actually building affordable units at that 30% AMI. Not everything needs to be at 80% AMI, because then the people that need the money or need those units, they're not accessible to them anyhow. Redistricting, matching the current populations. We were talking about that redistricting. So the last time that the constable precincts were redistricted was in 2013. And so like Tori said, we had a census happen in 2010, and then the constable precincts were redistricted in 2013. We know that the new census data was just released this last week, actually, this month. And so now that we have new census data, this is now an opportunity for this redistricting to happening of these constable jurisdictions, these lines. And so the redistricting happens at the county level, but these are these constable precincts that are being remapped. And so how do we understand population density that influences that? And one thing that I will highlight, just understanding density, jails create density. That is part of population. And so how are our elected officials strategically putting things in areas that create that density, which is apartment complexes and jails? So if we're talking about dense areas, that could be also very low income areas, because we know that most apartment complexes tend to be low income. So how does that influence who is living in which areas? And then the last one is influencing affordability terms. When we talk about low income housing tax credits, when we talk about funding for these subsidies, there's always a term limit that comes with it. And so unfortunately, sometimes they're as low as 10 or 15 years or 20 years of affordability. That does not help a generation, and that does not really even change with the demographic of the neighborhood. 20 years is not long enough to keep a unit affordable. And the moment that that term is done, if these units are targeted at 30% affordability, once that term limit is over, these private developers can start charging fair market value. And so why are we saying that these developers are allowed to get these government funding? They're allowed to have all this money from the government and get tax credits and get incentives, yet they're only allowed to incentivize land tenants for a short period of time, and then they're allowed to charge for profit, at fair market rent. That doesn't help anybody. So we need to make sure that when they're giving money to developers, they're holding them accountable to make sure that these units are affordable and accessible for very long periods of time, because that is what we know is needed to be able to help people in lower income areas to be able to grow in their own abilities. And maybe that is targeting, so then they can have that funding to be able to eventually move out of that extremely low income. And some of it may go into that labor and wages, and some of it may be in affordability and accessibility. So those are the things that we as housing advocates really focus on, being what is happening to tenants, how are we protecting tenants, and how are we giving them options to move into things that give them that accessibility to move out of that low income space.
All right, here's the slide I was looking for. So a lot of the things Julia just went over are things that you can use your vote or your voice to influence. And we also wanted to include some more like short-term actions that you can take as well. So next steps, you can find out what your community is or isn't doing to help renters. You can learn about your county's districts and justices. You can advocate for, well, that gets back to what Julia just said too, advocate for better tenant rights and affordable housing. 4, join local tenant organizations or follow them, listen to what they're saying. And then 5, volunteer with housers if you want. If you want to hear me talk some more, click that link, you know. But
yeah, and in volunteering with housers, like we were mentioning, our biggest push right now is observing court. And so we have volunteers either virtually or slowly trying to move into the court, because we know that the accessibility online is already limited. And so in observing what's happening in real time and understanding everything that we've kind of spoken about today, that's where we get a lot of assistance too. So if you find yourself wanting to do a little something extra, to also better understand what is evictions. I personally can say that before this work, I stepped into an eviction court once. And it was with a Harvey survivor that was getting evicted was getting foreclosed for not paying his mortgage. And so the nonprofit that was actually his mortgage lender evicted him. And that was my first experience. And so many people don't know what happens in eviction court. So we definitely invite you, if you'd like to be a part of this work, to observe with us and log these observations to have a better understanding of what's happening with justice of the peace, and to how we can further assist tenants and really promote what is housing stability in Texas. I see
Before,
that Leona had a question in the chat. She asked, who has the authority to expunge eviction records? JPs? I believe possibly. Currently, and so what we know as far as eviction, or well, the expunging of the records, well, I'm sorry, let me backtrack that. The sealing of the records. So expunging the records is one thing, and I don't know enough about that. But currently, what is happening during these eviction protections, and so based on the Supreme Court order of Texas, or the Texas Supreme Court, they have emergency order. The current order is order 48. And so in the order, it says that if a tenant and a landlord want to participate in rent relief program, their records must be sealed. And so as soon as the court kind of does that, because they do have everything online, as soon as they do that, and if you want to look up their case, it just says error, data file. And so I do think it has something to do within the Justice of the Peace Court. There may be some other things that have to happen legislatively to kind of get that in motion, but it would go within the courts. And I do also want to mention that while all this goes through the county, it feels like the commissioners have very minimal oversight as to what happens with the JPs themselves. I feel like they've got a little more handle on like what happens at county court and what they can do, but we have asked them where that accountability happens. And so it seems like JPs have their own accountability process. And what the county commissioners can do is fund their programs, and maybe in funding the programs, hold them accountable to the programs. But what the county commissioners themselves can do is very minimal to what they can hold the JPs accountable for. So that's also kind of tricky in how all these levels of like government and judiciary kind of talk to each other, but also have no real accountability and oversight over each other.
absolutely. That's why the voter is so important in all of this, right? The accountability is at the ballot box. And until the system changes, that is what we have. So any more questions? Any other questions? All right, thank you all very much. Both of you, Julia and Tori, keep on with your good work. Keep us posted on what we can do. The legislative session starts very soon. We are 9 months away from a new legislative session. And during that time, we can be prepared and be ready to continue our advocacy work for a better state of being for our fellow citizens in Texas. So with that, thank you all very much for your time and for the wealth of information you have provided. And to those of you who attended today, thank you for being with us. You all have a great rest of the afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.